Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, Wil'liam Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 32, where Rabbi cross-examines the New Testament. Tonight, part 2 of Matthew, chapter 27, with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Rabbi, it's good to have you back.
Good to be back here with you, William.
Definitely. Tonight, well, with that phrase, you really fit right in. Michael Sko is back. Yes. And, of course, we had our fun with the puns of Mike doing a mic check. Okay, that's enough for me tonight. Very good. All right. So last week we covered some ground, but it looked like we definitely needed to have more coverage on this chapter. So,
yeah, these are really chunky chapters here. And, last week, basically was the beginning of the end. We saw that Jesus was finally brought up to trial in front of Pontius Pilate, and it was interrupted by the story of Judas Iscariot committing suicide, and then back to the trial. And we see that incredibly, and this is really one of the great anomalies of the Gospels, Pontius Pilate seems to have no problem with Jesus whatsoever. As far as he's concerned, Jesus is okay by him, and he's puzzled. Why are the Jews so upset with this Jesus? And the whole trial is clearly written in a way to show that Pilate, is basically not interested in prosecuting him, and he's pretty much set to let him go free. And it's the Jews that are just pressing him, pressing him to prosecute Jesus. And finally, we're told that the Romans had this custom, allegedly, to let the Jewish people release one prisoner from jail each Jewish holiday. This happened to be at the Passover holiday. And so Pontius Pilate presents them with a fellow named Bar Abbas. We saw that means the son of the father. Some texts have him as Jesus Bar Abbas, Jesus son of the father. And then he says you have on the one hand this Bar Abbas, and on the other hand, by the way, who was a murderer and or a thief and a revolutionary. And then you had on the other hand Jesus, who Pontius Pilate keeps on referring to as one that is called the Messiah. So that's the choice. You get to let the Messiah out of prison or this robber murderer. And unexplainably,
right.
The Jews chose Barabbas. And Pilate says, okay, so what should I do with Jesus? And the Jews say, well, crucify him. And Pilate can't believe it. They say, yeah, his blood should be upon us and our children, which again is, I mentioned last week, probably one of the most non-historical passages in the Gospels. And so Pilate doesn't really want to, but he washes his hands. He declares, he's not interested in this execution. His hands are clean. He's basically saying it's on your head, you Jews. But then Pilate, has Jesus scourged, flogged, beaten up pretty badly, whipped, and then taken off to be crucified. So we begin this week with the walk towards the crucifixion, beginning in verse 32. And we're told that Jesus here did not carry his cross to the place of the execution. We're told they found someone named Simon of Cyrene. And he was the one that Matthew says was compelled to bear the cross of Jesus. I guess he didn't want to do it, but the Roman soldiers forced him to do it. It's interesting that in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 17, there we're told that Jesus carried his own cross all the way to the place of execution.
Interesting.
Yeah, so here we have, and actually it's interesting that when you go through these chapters, the chapters of the crucifixion and next week's chapter of the resurrection, and you try to compare the four gospel accounts, there's almost no agreement between the four accounts. I mean, it's impossible to really figure out what really happened because you're not getting the same story from really the four sources. So we're told that in Matthew, at least, Simon of Cyrene carries the cross, and they come to a place called Golgotha, which is to say it's place of a skull. They come to this hill, and there they gave Jesus sour wine. Sour wine actually is vinegar mixed with gall to drink. Gall is a bitter product of either animals or it could be vegetable, but it's a pretty miserable mixture. Sour wine, vinegar, and mixed with gall to drink. Although, interestingly, in Mark, it's wine mixed with myrrh. It's not with gall. And in Luke and in John, it's just vinegar, just the sour wine, not mixed with anything. And so Matthew says that Jesus tasted this horrible mixture, but he wouldn't drink it. In Mark, we're told that he wouldn't even taste it. So in verse 35, they crucify Jesus. They basically nail him to this cross. And then we're told that the Roman soldiers here divided his garments, casting lots, which is strange. I mean, I think that this detail about the soldiers casting lots for his garments was really inserted into the narrative for effect, probably to line up with the verse they're going to be quoting from Psalm 22. Right. But the truth is, when you think about it, if he was just viciously flogged and scourged by the Roman soldiers prior to this, he didn't really have many clothes to divide. I mean, his clothes are probably ripped to shreds and all bloody.
Right.
So it's hard to understand, why the soldiers are going to be, so anxious to win them in a casting lots.
That's a good point, because every time I've ever seen this whole scenario depicted, it's always been like where he's wearing nothing more than a loincloth.
Oh yeah, I mean he's basically they would whip him. I mean this scourging, was not with rubber bands. It wasn't with dental floss. I mean this was with ropes that had either broken shells or broken pieces of glass or pieces of iron at the end. I mean the Roman scourging was really nasty business, and I mean I'm sure that Mel Gibson went a little bit over the top in depicting it, but they really ripped you to pieces in this process. And so his clothing probably wasn't in shape between being torn to shreds and bloody, like a bloody mess, why they'd want to cast lots for his garments.
Right. I mean, much less even handle them with their hands.
Yeah. I mean, it's a strange detail.
Doesn't make any sense.
And Matthew insists that it came, again, we always remember in Matthew, more than any other gospel, you have what they refer to as the fulfillment texts. And Matthew is constantly trying to show that the life of Jesus was anticipated by the Hebrew scriptures, by what it's written in the Jewish Bible. We've seen literally, every single time he's quoted the scripture so far, it's been essentially ripped out of context and misapplied. And the same thing happens here. He quotes from the book of Psalms, chapter 22, verse 19. In a Christian Bible, it would be verse 18, where the psalmist says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Now, this passage in Psalms, it's not a prophecy. There's no prophecy here in the book of Psalms.
It was a statement of fact, right?
Yeah, and it's not about the Messiah. I mean, Jewish commentaries have basically three ways of understanding this psalm. One seems a little bit out there, but the two simplest explanations is that it's either speaking about the suffering of King David, which he did plenty of suffering over his lifetime, or it's really speaking conceptually about how the Jewish people suffer constantly, to the extent where our clothes being ripped off our backs. I mean, it's just basically an imagery to depict how much suffering the Jews have gone through. The traditional Midrash understands this psalm actually to be speaking about Queen Esther when she goes in to see King Ahasuerus. And specifically here, everyone was lined up saying, "Oh, she's dead. I mean, because you just can't go and see the king without being invited by the king, and she wasn't invited. So everyone assumed that, they're going to be lopping off her head, and she wasn't just wearing bloody, torn up clothing. She was wearing royal garments. People are going to want to divide them,
right,
and split them up. But I mean, it's hard to. You have to really accept that midrash, as a tradition and sort of an oblique interpretation.
Rabbi, I need you to comment on something if you would just take a minute or so.
Sure.
Because an argument that keeps popping up all over the place is, well, these are the synoptic gospels. These are about different vantage points. I mean, I know how I've addressed it in the past, and it seems to be pretty effective. But what is the best way to point out that this isn't just a vantage point problem here? This is like literally a contradiction problem.
Well, it's interesting when that's often the way Christian apologists approach these discrepancies. They'll say if you have 4 different people watching a car accident, they'll each report it a little bit differently. Which is true. You're not going to get exactly the same report between different witnesses, although it's interesting that in Jewish law, if the witnesses do not corroborate exactly, they're thrown out, and you won't get a conviction.
Interesting.
But what's interesting is that in the Gospels, you have a few problems with this approach. Number one, none of the Gospel writers were eyewitnesses, and that's an important thing to remember. It's not as if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were sitting here watching in the bleachers, and they're just giving their slant on what happened. So it's not that we have the reports of 4 different eyewitnesses. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were people who lived much later. These gospel accounts are written between 40 and 70 years after the events take place. They're written in Greek. The followers of Jesus spoke an Aramaic. They were basically illiterate. They weren't literate Greek-speaking scholars. And so it's pretty clear that the authors of the Gospels are not the disciples of Jesus. They're not people who were there living in the first century with Jesus. And they write these much later in Greek. And they give the Gospel accounts the names of the disciples to bolster the credibility of the accounts, meaning that it's not, we're not being told it's written by, some Greek historian living around the year 90. Whoever's writing it is claiming that it was written by, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And that was actually quite common, in the times, which was to, make it seem as if some earlier source is writing the document. So the other problem is that eyewitnesses don't disagree on certain things. For example,
major things, right?
Yeah, we're going to see that, there's a question about when the crucifixion took place. Was it the day after the offering of the Passover, or was it the day before the Passover? That's not a matter of perspective.
Right.
A matter of perspective would be, was it a dark gray car or a light gray car?
Right.
That does come out when different witnesses testify. But, was it Jesus carrying the cross or Simon of Cyrene? That's not a difference of perspective.
Right.
That's, a very standard sort of counterclaim by Christian apologists, but it really doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. And I think it's important to not place too much emphasis on these inconsistencies, but it doesn't inspire confidence, meaning that some of them possibly can be explained and harmonized. But I think that when we see literally dozens of inconsistencies, some more serious than others, it simply doesn't inspire confidence in the idea that we're reading real history. And I think that what we will see, especially next week when we discuss the resurrection, we'll see that the stories were developed over time, and you can actually trace the development from the earlier stories to the later stories. It's not so clear in this week's chapter, but in the chapter 28, it becomes very clear that the stories went through an evolution in order to make them more effective. So here we're going to see there's another discrepancy. Again, it's not a, this is not an earth-shattering one, but it's interesting that we're told that after they divided up his garments in verse 36, they sat down, they watched over him, and they put up over his head the accusation, the crime that was written against him. Meaning the Romans would normally, when they crucified someone, there was a crossbeam across the top, and they would have written down what the person was being executed for. So Matthew says that the crossbeam said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews," which is interesting because that's exactly why Romans would have wanted to put him to death.
Right. Good point.
Right, and exactly why it makes it so mysterious that Pilate has this written on the cross, and yet Pilate, in the trial is saying, what's the problem with this guy? I see nothing wrong with him. So it's very incongruous, the fact that, he is crucified for a crime the Romans really would have nailed him for, and yet Pilate seems to be totally disengaged and disinterested from the proceedings. Now in Mark chapter 15, verse 26, it says something slightly different. It just says the King of the Jews. Again, this wouldn't be a matter of perspective. If you're reading what it says, it's just a few words. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews, is not the same as the King of the Jews. In Luke chapter 23, verse 38, it says, "This is the King of the Jews." Doesn't mention the name Jesus. And John chapter 19, verse 19 says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." So it's interesting that all four Gospels differ slightly, but they differ in terms of what the charge exactly was against him. And then we're told that there were two robbers. Again, it's not clear if they were robbers or they were revolutionaries or they were highwaymen. It's probably less likely they were robbers because, again, the Romans didn't normally crucify people who were stealing eggs from the market. It was usually reserved for people that were political dangers to the Romans. But whatever, there were two other people. And again, people often think of Jesus as the only person ever crucified, and we know that there were probably at least 100,000 Jews that were crucified around that time. So it was not that unusual. And we're told at the end of this piece here in verses 39 to 44 that everyone that passed by was mocking Jesus. They were making fun of him. They were saying, "Oh, the big shot here, he thinks he's the Son of God. Let him save himself. Let him take himself down from the cross." So he's basically being mocked here in this account. Now in verse 48, we're told that from the 6th hour. Now, 6th hour back then would have been about noon. But normally a normal day starts at about 6 a.m. That would be like a typical day. And therefore, that would be the first hour, 6 a.m. So the 6th hour would be noon. And so we're told here that from the 6th hour, noon, until the 9th hour, which would be about 3 p.m., so for those 3 hours, there was a darkness over all of the land. Now, it seems like what it's saying is all of the land of Israel. It doesn't seem to be saying darkness all over Jerusalem, but even if it was just Jerusalem, there's no historical evidence that in the middle of the day, but that would be the brightest time of the day, it went totally dark. There's no other gospel says that. Josephus doesn't say it. Philo doesn't say it. The Talmud doesn't say it. No Roman sources say it. It's just simply, and we see many things that Matthew does like this. He just says these wild things, and there's just no corroboration. And then we're told that about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which is Aramaic for, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, I know that Christians have never understood this passage in the way I'm going to explain it, but it seems that from an unbiased perspective, for Jesus to cry out at this point, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is a recognition that the program has not worked out. Something has gone terribly wrong. Jesus was not expecting to die, even though we saw that many times Matthew has Jesus saying, or I would suggest these words were put into the mouth of Jesus to say that, look, I have to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things and be crucified and be raised up on the third day. They keep on having Jesus, prior to coming to Jerusalem, predict exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
But it doesn't really seem that he did, because first of all, we know that none of his disciples expected this to happen. They're all shocked at his crucifixion. They simply, it's almost impossible to imagine that he ever said this. And so it seems the most likely that Jesus was expecting to live and fulfill the messianic redemption, that he was expecting. It didn't look good because he was a prisoner of the Romans, but he probably expected some great miracle to happen and for God to, turn things around like God can easily do. And so when he sees that he's about to die, he is bitterly disappointed and he screams out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, what's strange to me is that he recites this verse in Aramaic translation. Why wouldn't he just say it in Hebrew?
Right.
If he knew the psalm, and Jews usually, even today, throughout history, we usually will, recite sacred literature in the original language. It's only if you don't know, let's say, Hebrew today, that you might read the book of Psalms in English. But it's impossible to imagine that Jesus was allegedly a rabbi that
Right.
he didn't know Hebrew.
Right.
So why he'd be quoting this in Aramaic is very, very difficult to understand. And by saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" We've been discussing this theme in the past. Did Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew claim to be God in the flesh? Did he claim to be God? Did he claim to be divine? It doesn't seem like he's claiming to be God here when he calls out to God, in great disappointment, "Why have you forsaken me?" So again, this would be to me another one of the, I believe, many, many clues that we've seen. I think that on the balance, the vast majority of relevant passages in Matthew seem to really argue against the idea that Matthew or even Jesus thought he was divine. Now, what the gospel goes on to say here in verse 47 is that upon hearing this, some of those who stood there, when they heard him crying out, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." Now, why in the world would anyone think that, this is a call for Elijah the prophet to come?
Maybe the Romans were the ones who were saying it, not the.
Why? Why would anyone?
Yeah, they wouldn't even know that. That's kind of weird. That's a good point.
Why would someone screaming out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Why would that be interpreted as a call for Elijah the prophet to come?
Well, if it was in a language they didn't know, and if some of the Jewish people, if I don't know, even if some of them didn't speak Aramaic, which doesn't make sense either, there's the whole idea of when the redemption does come, Elijah's cup, at Pesach and the whole 9 yards. So maybe that was their, I don't know, maybe he was groaning so much they couldn't understand him. But then again, how did they write this if that's the case?
Yeah, or maybe he could be calling for his mommy, or be calling call for God to come and save him. So I think that the only possibility I can think of is that the word my God in Hebrew is Eli, Eli, and Elijah is Eliyahu. And it's sort of similar, Eliyahu, Eli. The first few letters of the name Eliyahu is Eli. So maybe because the name sounds similar, they assumed he was calling out for Elijah.
Nice.
But I don't know. It's just a speculation. And immediately, we're told, one of them ran and took a sponge filled with sour wine and put it on a reed and offered it to him to drink. This is the second time in the story that he's offered some sour wine to drink. And the rest said, everyone else said, but leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah will come to save him.
Interesting.
And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. So this is the point at which Jesus dies.
So this is, let me get this straight. This is only around 6 hours from
This would be sometime after 3 in the afternoon.
Okay. And it just, yes, go ahead.
What's important to remember is that this is not in the dead of the summer, right? This is not in August. This is talking Passover, would usually be April.
Right.
And so, nighttime is going to be, 7:30. And this is now a little bit after 3 already. So there isn't a lot of time now to get him, taken off the cross and interred somewhere. There's not a lot of time left. And then, by the way, not only does someone have to, look, normally people that were crucified were not buried. The Romans would throw them into a common ditch. Okay. They weren't honored with burial if they were being crucified. And that's probably what happened to the other 2 men that were crucified. It seems that we'll see that there was someone that wanted to specifically give Jesus more of a proper burial. But it's interesting that not only will, if someone, in this case it's Joseph of Arimathea, he has to not just worry about getting Jesus, to a burial place in time, but he's going to have to himself get back, home before nightfall. He's not going to want to be out all night in the dark. So there's not a lot of time left. This is not in the heat of the summer where there's many, many hours left till sundown. And we're told in verse 51 that right after Jesus dies, behold, the veil of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Again, there's no evidence of this. There's no reporting of this anywhere else. It's not in any other gospel. It's not in Josephus. It's not in the Jewish sources. It's not anywhere. But Matthew, again, simply makes the claim that the temple veil was torn and the earthquake. There was an earthquake. Matthew is very quick to claim there are earthquakes happening, because we're going to see in chapter 28 there's another earthquake that Matthew claims took place. Again, there's no record, and you don't usually have earthquakes in Jerusalem, but there's no record that at that time the whole land went dark from 12 till 3, and then there was an earthquake, and then the veil of the temple tore in half. And then Matthew makes his most incredible claim. He says in verse 52 that the graves were opened, right? These are the graves of people that have been buried, and many bodies of the saints, of the righteous people who had fallen asleep, it means they were dead.
Right.
They were raised. So these people came back to life. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Now, this is a real howler, because, if anything would have been top story and would have been, something that everyone on the planet would have known about, if righteous people came out of their graves and, appeared to many people in Jerusalem, people would have been floored. They would have been freaking out. And yet, no one else knows about this but Matthew. It's not in Mark, it's not in Luke, it's not in John, it's not in Acts, it's not in Paul, it's not in Josephus, it's not in Philo, it's not in Tacitus, it's not in the Talmud. It would have been the major news story of the day. No one knows about it. And also, I never noticed this until just today when I was looking this over. It doesn't say that the righteous people came out of their graves and walked around Jerusalem at this point. It's saying that right after Jesus died, these people raised up, meaning that somehow they awoken from their death. They raised up somehow. Maybe they sat up in their tombs. But they didn't come out of the tombs until after the resurrection. So what they were doing for these 2 or so days, between waking up from their death and coming into Jerusalem and appearing to many people, it's hard to know. Also, Matthew, I think, would have been served himself much better if he just said that righteous people came out of their graves and walked around Jerusalem, because there it's take it or leave it. You can always say that, they came out of their graves, but no one saw them. But Matthew is claiming that they appeared to many people, and that's what it would have made the story a front page story. So in verse 54, when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Now, it's hard to understand what happened here that would have made anyone say that this Jesus is the Son of God. Because there's an earthquake, that means that Jesus is the Son of God. So this is very hard to understand. What happened in this scene that led the centurion and the other ones guarding Jesus to say that this man was truly the Son of God? And also, if you compare this story to Luke chapter 23, verse 47, they don't say this man was the Son of God. There in Luke, they just say this man was innocent. And we're told in verse 55 that many women followed Jesus from the Galilee. He had many women followers, and they were ministering to him. They were looking on from far away, and among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joses, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. So basically, that's the scene at the death of Jesus. And in verse 57, we now have the story of the burial of Jesus. We're told that when evening had come, so it's interesting that Joseph of Arimathea doesn't show up, right after the death of Jesus. Jesus seems to be dying sometime after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I would guess from the way the story takes place, he's dying at approximately 4 o'clock, between 3 and 4. But we told that it wasn't until evening, which would have been at that time of the year, about 7:30, that this Joseph of Arimathea, who was a rich man, had himself become a disciple of Jesus. So we're told here that he was a disciple of Jesus. The other Gospels identify him as one of the judges on the Sanhedrin. So he was obviously a secret disciple of Jesus if the Sanhedrin was always seeking to kill Jesus.
Right.
And so Joseph went to Pilate and asked him for the body of Jesus, because I guess as a follower, he didn't want to have Jesus thrown into a common grave or thrown into a pit. So Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. Pilate said that's okay. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in the new tomb which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb, and he departed. He probably departed to go home because it was already getting dark. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. They were watching what was going on. Now, it was the custom at that time. It became actually a universal custom in the 2nd century, but it was a custom that Jews were buried in a plain linen shroud. And they're called tachrichim. It's still done to this day. Jews are buried in plain white linen shrouds. And in the 1st century, it was very common for people, when they were buried, to be actually laid out on a platform inside a tomb that was above ground. And they would lie on this platform until the body totally decomposed. And when that happened, they would then gather the bones and place the bones in an ossuary, which is a bone box. And that bone box was then permanently interred in a tomb, sometimes in what they call family tombs. It's interesting that my friend Simcha Yakubovich who lived in Toronto for many years, but is an Israeli, now lives in Israel. So Simcha did a lot of research on the tomb in Talpiot in Jerusalem, and I think it was first discovered in 1980. But Simcha and other scholars began to look at the names on the ossuaries, and one of the names on the ossuary is someone named Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus the son of Joseph. Well, that's basically the name of Jesus. And Simcha found that many of the other ossuaries in this tomb, this family tomb, had names very, very similar to the names in the gospel stories. You had Mary Magdalene, you had some other Mary, and you had Joseph, and you had very, very common names that popped up in the gospel stories. And Simcha basically proposed that this very well might be the actual burial tomb of Jesus. And the reason is this. Normally, when someone was buried, they were prepared for burial by the body being washed, and then they were anointed with oils and spices. And that's because they didn't want the decomposing body to smell more than it would have to. They try to mitigate and neutralize the smells. And because it was so late in the afternoon, it was evening time already, Joseph of Arimathea didn't have time to properly prepare the body. So the theory is that he basically quickly put the body temporarily in this tomb, but his plan would be to come back after the Sabbath and take the body and then bury it in the more appropriate way after he prepared the body for burial. And what Simcha seems to suggest is that this tomb they found in East Jerusalem, in Talpiot, was the family tomb that Jesus was interred into. I should say that the vast majority of archaeologists and Bible scholars and other people doing research either totally reject this theory. Again, most of them are Christians that would be very reluctant to admit that Jesus' body lies in state in Jerusalem now. Right. Or they basically say it's highly speculative. But there aren't many people who've signed on to it. I think that James Tabor is on side with Jesus, with Simcha here. But again, a lot of research is still being done. Simcha did a film on this topic. He wrote a book on this topic. And if you read the archaeological journals, this is still being discussed. Beginning in verse 62, we have another story that only appears in Matthew, which is interesting. We're told in verse 62 that on the next day, which followed the day of preparation. The day of preparation was Friday. Friday was preparing for the Shabbat. And that's when Jesus was crucified, on a Friday, buried Friday in the evening. So on the next day, which was the Shabbat, the Holy Sabbath, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember while he was alive how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.'" I'm not sure where they heard this, because as far as I remember, Jesus only told this to his followers. But maybe the word got out. And they say, therefore, in verse 64, "Command that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, he has risen from the dead, so that the last deception will be worse than the first." And Pilate said to them, "You have a guard. You go your way and make it secure as you know how." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. I just wanted to point out 3 things concerning this little story here. First of all, I mentioned that only Matthew has this detail. No one else mentions guards being sent to the tomb on Saturday. The second problem is that Pilate has said, if I understand correctly, that he's not going to send guards to to secure the tomb. He says to the Pharisees and to the chief priests, you have your own people, so you secure the tomb. So I think the problem there might be, how could they do this on the Sabbath? Normally, for example, it's not permitted to move stones on the Sabbath. There's a Jewish law called the muktzah. Muktzah means that anything that really doesn't have a normal Sabbath use can't be moved on the Sabbath unless it was prepared and designated beforehand, before the Sabbath, that it was going to be used. But they had no way of knowing that this is going to be something they were going to do before the Sabbath. Otherwise, they would have approached Pilate before the Sabbath. So one problem, just a technical problem, is how you have these religious Jews engaged in moving this, even sealing. I'm not sure even how they sealed a rock, but whatever they were doing seems to be a violation of the laws of the Sabbath. The third problem, which is really the biggest problem, is, when you read the story, they say, in verse 64, therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away. So what is the point of sealing the tomb on Saturday, either in the late morning or early afternoon, when someone could have already come Friday night late or early Saturday morning? And it seems to be useless at that point. So the possibility is that either this story never took place, there was no special sealing of the tomb with guards, and what is likely to have happened is that after the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea did what he planned to do, which was to come back after the Sabbath and properly prepare the body for burial. Or if there were guards, then either he or someone else easily could have removed the body late Friday night or very early Saturday morning before the guards showed up. This is part of the puzzle of the alleged empty tomb, which we'll be speaking about next week. But this chapter actually, there's not a lot of meaty, controversial stuff in this chapter. It's sort of straightforward. It just tells us the story of the crucifixion of Jesus and his death, and his at least quick burial. And next week, when we get to chapter 28, God willing, we'll have a lot to talk about in terms of this critical story, because within Christian theology, there is nothing as important as the resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
As Paul says in Corinthians, if Jesus did not come back from the dead and wasn't resurrected, your faith is in vain. So this is actually a massively important story, and hopefully we'll be able to analyze it and discuss it next week. Well,
let me get one final thought from you. There is one thing that seems to be a little controversial or contradicting, and with Isaiah 53, it says, and he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. And it seems like just the exact opposite happened. In his death, he didn't die with the rich, he died with thieves. And where they placed him was actually in a rich man's tomb. Do you think there might be a misunderstanding there on my part?
No, I've heard that that thought. It's many people have suggested that as a problem. It certainly might be a problem. I think there are ways of squirming out of it. but
yes, indeed. Yeah. Yes, indeed. Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I can't wait till next week. It seems like I've been jumping the gun trying to get to it for about 3 weeks in a row.
We had technical problems.
Yeah, but that's okay. It's good. It's going to be a good one as usual.
Well, my microphone was resurrected.
It was, and you know what? You sound fantastic. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll catch you next week, same time, same place, Sunday night, 9:30 p.m. for Rabbi Cross Examines the New Testament with the Big Bang of the New Testament. Hopefully we'll all survive it. So shalom, shalom, everyone. And until next time, Rabbi, Laila Tov. Shalom, everyone.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.